a truly historic day in Washington. Tonight, I'm about to be joined by special guest Donny Deutsch, who just spoke with Michael Cohen after his testimony, and our analyst, Maya Wiley. I'm going to give you a very short intro because if you follow the news, you know the gist. Here it is. The president's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, testifying under oath against Donald Trump for many, many hours, laying out in detail a damning series of allegations. Some sounded criminal against a sitting president. Some just sounded terrible, bad things detailed by a person who says he was in the room. This was extraordinary, unprecedented testimony from one of only 6 former Trump aides indicted in the Mueller probe, and one of the only ones yet to speak this way. None of the others have talked about their crimes under oath or other details under oath. They haven't. No one has pointed this finger so directly at their old boss, Donald Trump. And to Trump's defenders on the committee, Cohen had a simple message. He said, look, I used to be like you. I used to defend this man just like you for the same reasons you do. And the only difference between us is I put that in the past tense. Take a look.
Documents that are irrefutable and demonstrate I did the same thing that you're doing now for 10 years. I protected Mr. Trump for 10 years. I can only warn people, the more people that follow Mr. Trump, as I did blindly, are going to suffer the same consequences that I'm suffering.
I'm joined, as promised, right now by Maya Wiley, a former counsel of the mayor of New York City and civil prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, and Donny Deutsch, a longtime friend of Michael Cohen's and an analyst for us at MSNBC. Before we talk about what you've learned, having been alongside this man the whole time, and what was, for anyone watching, I think at times emotional testimony from a person who is going to go be incarcerated, I want to ask you, what was important that Michael Cohen said that sounded true and implicates the president?
Number one, overall, his testimony was very credible, I thought. And part of it being credible is he didn't overstate. He was very careful with the facts. And so it was very credible when he talked about the way in which Donald Trump worked, the fact that he was directed to make payments and how that was structured through Alan Weisselberg. It was also, the way he talked about the Trump assets and the way Donald Trump would inflate the assets if it was to his advantage, say, in the interests of insurance, or deflate in the statement of his assets if it was helpful for his taxes. And that was really, it was not a big period of time in the testimony today, but it was pretty significant because those would be new potential criminal charges where he is directly implicating Donald Trump. It was credible because the president himself has not released his tax returns, which was always odd and never quite explained to the American public why he wouldn't. That might be a reason. And I also think, his points about Donald Trump's wink, wink, nod, nod in terms of the Trump-Moscow Tower, right? Where he says very clearly, look, no, he did not directly tell me. But what he did was what he always does, is he looked me in the eye. I remember his opening statement. He looked me in the eye and said, there is no business in Moscow, as he then went out and lied to the public. That is kind of very typical ways in which we see crime bosses instructing people.
You mentioned crime bosses. That was the other important point. Elijah Cummings, who we'll show later in this broadcast, came out at the end and made a plea. He said, look, I've turned down over 100 interview requests. We wanted to get to the facts. Another shoe may drop. This isn't normal. And as we get more eyewitness accounts, the country has to deal with this, not as a political matter, and perhaps not strictly as a legal matter, because so much of what I noticed that was detailed today was truly gangster-like activity, not all of which would be chargeable. In that vein, before I go to Donny, I want to play Michael Cohen talking about the threats, the way that threatening people, and look, you can use words in clever ways that aren't technically crimes, but the ways that Donald Trump routinely and constantly used him to threaten people to get his way. Take a look.
How many times did Mr. Trump ask you to threaten an individual or entity on his behalf?
Quite a few times.
50 times?
More.
100 times?
More.
200 times?
More.
500 times?
Probably. Over the 10 years.
Over the 10 years, he asked you.
And when you say threaten, I'm talking with litigation or an argument.
Bullying behavior. We've also heard it in the language. And when you're talking about, calling people rats, when you're talking about a sitting president, that kind of behavior becomes an abuse of authority. Under the precedent we have from Richard Nixon, is abuse of authority is in and of itself a ground for impeachment. We're hearing about a sitting president directly from someone who has known him deeply personally and his ways of working, and has essentially said those ways continued into the White House. Not on every single type of claim, but that this was conversations that he had with the president in the White House.
Donnie, I want to leave some space for you to speak about this any which way you want. This is a friend of yours. He doesn't claim that he did everything the right way. But I wonder how you felt watching Chairman Cummings, who I think does take his role seriously, who went out of his way to try to do some bipartisan outreach and mend fences during the hearing. But when Chairman Cummings was pretty careful, made a point in the hearing to stay on the record. Here we are. This is not normal. But to say that he's from Baltimore, that he knows how this stuff works in prison, and that in his view, the President of the United States increased the risk of physical danger to Michael Cohen, your friend, by calling him a rat so publicly as he prepares to go do 3 years.
Yeah. I know Chairman Cummings was so emotional and so upset the night that Trump went after Michael's father-in-law and kind of started this threat of the family and took it very, very emotionally. And I think you saw the kind of man Chairman Cummings was today. A lot to unpack here. First of all, as you said in the tease, I spoke to Michael a few minutes ago, actually, he was with both of his lawyers. I said, how you doing? He said exhausted. I mean, I was exhausted watching. So, and keep in mind, he did 9 hours yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, it's staggering. I said, would you have done anything differently? He goes, no. And he brought up a point that, he said during the hearings, and I would say also, that the Republicans not once, with all of the charges, with all of the visual aids, with the checks, with the documents, did they bring up Donald Trump's name once. Literally. This was how many hours was this? Not one Republican brought up, other than say, don't smear our president, didn't have any questions against any of the allegations. It was this constant theme of...
On a committee that, again, this is not the Judiciary Committee.
Right.
This is the committee that does oversight of the government, particularly when you talk about abuse of the federal government, something that any intellectual conservative would want to reckon with. You mentioned that. I want to now play, so viewers can take it in themselves, that moment with Congressman Cummings. Take a look.
I know it's got to be painful being called a rat. I live in the inner city of Baltimore, all right? And when you call somebody a rat, that's one of the worst things you can call them, because when they go to prison, that means a snitch. I'm just saying. And so the president called you a rat. We're better than that. We really are. I know that this has been hard. I know that you face a lot. I know that you are worried about your family. But this is a part of your destiny. And we have got to get back to normal. With that, this meeting is adjourned.
That's how it ended. Tell me about the emotion on Michael's face.
You saw look, I've spent hundreds of hours or dozens of hours with Michael, and the only time he cracks and gets emotional is about his family. And, he talked it when he referenced there. And it was painful to watch as a guy that knowing what he was going through. And look, the game today was not, do I like Michael? Do I think he's a good guy? Is he sympathetic? Is he credible? And to me, where he really showed his credibility was the places he came to defend Donald Trump and exonerate him. The 3 most heinous things that were teased, that were put out there, think about it. oh, we hear there's a tape about that you smacked Melania. And I've heard that rumors. And he went, there is no such tape. And that Mr. Trump would never do that.
Right. We've never once touched that story on this show because there's nothing found in it. But as you say, it came up in a committee hearing today.
He could have said,
he, under oath, knocked it down.
Very instantly could have said, look, I've heard that also. I don't know. But I've heard a lot of those rumors. Same thing where, as far as the salacious, the P tape, where he could have easily said, yes, I haven't seen it, but I've heard people have seen it. I mean, easily. Absolutely does not exist. And even with collusion, where he specifically said, I have not directly seen collusion. So, that to me gave him credibility. The other thing going in that gave him credibility, he had everything to lose and nothing to gain. He told the truth today. He doesn't get a day off of jail for doing that. Had he lied once, he'd be facing more jail. So the Republicans' entire raison d'etre of, liar, liar, pants on fire was absurd to begin with. When somebody tells an untruth, you can never believe anything they have to say. I thought the moment with Meadows, when Meadows looked like a fool, when he was waving that document around, and it turned out that Michael's point was correct and his point was incorrect. I also thought AOC, there were so many openings, to your point also, for where investigations can go. I have not been a big fan of AOC. I thought she did a great job because she teed up the tax returns. I love that all the kids came up very explicitly, and we know that at this point Mueller has not even interviewed Junior yet, and there was certainly things about Junior. So, and going back to the Southern District, and their relationship with Michael has completely changed in the last few months. It was very contentious going in, and now they actually signed off when he wanted that 2-month extension. Not only they actually recommended it to the judge for his health to get. So they're working very closely together. And Ari, I've said on the show, on many shows, this ends with a RICO charge in the Southern District. That's where this ends, where they go after the entire organization. You talked about a mob boss. That's what it was built for. Somebody who sits atop a criminal enterprise and is responsible for all of it. And
that's a district you worked in. I want to play, as you think about that possibility, Cohen alleging that Trump did something that is basically what Cohen is partly going to jail for. The idea of who gets away with what. That Trump inflated his assets, which, yeah, you can lie in public about it, but again, did it towards a bank. You were pointing out as we were coming out onto the set that regarding insurance companies, it's also a big deal. Take a look at that moment today.
To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to a bank in order to help him obtain a loan?
These documents and others were provided to Deutsche Bank on one occasion where I was with them in our attempt to obtain money so that we can put a bid on the Buffalo Bills.
Because this is a big news night and we've been pretty serious, I'm going to say it's time to bifurcate. And I'm going to ask you a bifurcated question. I know you can handle it.
I'm ready.
I don't even know what that word means.
One, if that's true, what is the legal exposure for Donald Trump and the people who helped him do it? And two, even if it's not true, as a matter of governance, is there still a question when you see this outlined under oath, hanging over a president who owes Deutsche Bank, which has been prosecuted for Russian money laundering, for all of these foreign debts as people try to figure out what's going on in the White House and what's he negotiating overseas?
One, bank fraud. We don't know yet.
I'll count. You do it.
Okay, thank you. Donnie's counting. Right. Bank fraud. We don't know yet if there's sufficient evidence, but it could lead to money laundering. That's a possibility. We haven't heard sufficient evidence, so I'm not saying that's where it would go. But anytime you start to talk about bank transactions lying to banks, remember that's how they got Paul Manafort. There's always the potential. Could be wire fraud as well, depending on how he communicated information, if it was fraudulent information. On your second question, bifurcation. Right. All right, you can use the other hand. Okay. On the bifurcation, on the other question, so sitting president who has demonstrated before coming to office that he is willing to stretch the truth, hide money transactions, make inaccurate statements potentially to insurance companies and to banks, now and is hiding the attempt to make money off of a foreign government. Now he's in office, and as we know, two of the lines of investigation is Trump inauguration and the inaugural committee, and also the extent to which there's been influence by foreign governments on policy decisions of the United States. So any of those vulnerabilities, financial vulnerabilities because he needs money or is dependent on business he gets from foreign governments, could potentially, we don't know, but could potentially influence how he makes policy decisions. And we have certainly seen some troubling behavior from this president when it comes to foreign policy decisions.
Right, and what you're listing off, sometimes we have a big banner like Trump lied. The banner we have on breaking news right now is it was hard to fit in, if you look at the bottom of the screen, all of the documented things that he alleged against Donald Trump. And this is where this is not normal. I mean, people can say, well, maybe they don't want to believe this man, but when he and Donald Trump are diametrically opposed, you're choosing between Donald Trump's tweets by a person that the Washington Post has found to have lied more than any other politician ever, and Michael Cohen's testimony under oath, which, as you've just defined, has a lot of pressure on it for its veracity. They can't both be right.
With visual aids also,
and documentation. So this is not a normal day. This is a night for America to really process that. I want to bring in a member of Congress. You both stay with me. Part of our special coverage, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Knowlton's on the beat tonight. She questioned Michael Cohen today. And Congresswoman, thank you for making time on a long day. I want to begin right away with when you asked him about the timing of the so-called hush money payments to Stormy Daniels.
Were you concerned about this news story becoming public right after the Access Hollywood study in terms of impact on the election?
I was concerned about it, but more importantly, Mr. Trump was concerned about it.
That was my next question. What was the president's concern about these matters becoming public?
After the wildfire that encompassed the Billy Bush tape, that a second follow-up to it would have been pleasant.
What did you learn there, and what was the import in your view of Michael Cohen explaining their thinking under oath that in a close election, after what they'd been through, another story like that might have made all the difference in the world?
To be sure, Ari, because what the time frame during which these salacious events came up was October. And we're talking about the November election. So I'm trying to find out if Donald Trump is trying to save himself from being brought down before the election. And I have to tell you that there's no doubt in my mind, in fact, he even got ahead of me on it, that Michael Cohen indicated that that's exactly what he was about. During that month after those matters came out, and the public never got to judge him based on those matters, which may have had an effect, and therefore may have affected who became president of the United States.
It may not matter in the legal sense of what Mueller is investigating, but I wonder to you, as a member of Congress, given the line of questioning and what you just said tonight, does it matter if the reasonable inference can be drawn that if not for that confessed crime, Donald Trump might not be president?
I suppose if you're a Democrat, it matters a lot. But I think it matters a great deal because there are very few matters that you can put your finger on and say, but for that, we wouldn't have Donald Trump as a president every day going through murder with us and keeping us from getting to real business. So I think this mattered. I think this October surprise mattered on who would become president, and Donald Trump knew it and made sure it would not come to light.
And Congresswoman, I wouldn't normally ask you to assess the approach and the state of mind of one of your colleagues. You all work together well, but it's not a normal night. I wonder, have you seen Chairman Cummings in that state before? Have you seen him like this ever, or a handful of times? And what do you think moved him to that degree? Because he seemed to give a real plea, both in the closing of the hearing and in his remarks right afterward, to the nation, almost across party lines, asking people sort of through the TV screen tonight, listen to what you just heard, look at this, this is different.
Yeah, I've seen him, but rarely. there's a part of him that wants to use testimony to teach and to bring us together. After such a powerful day as this, you note that he did not read from a script. He was touched by the position he was in, and he spoke from his heart. I must tell you, it didn't last very long, but when it was all over, I don't know if the television picked up. I suppose I should say the Democrats clapped. We didn't clap any other time during that hearing.
Yeah, because it was beyond. It felt bigger than the sort of factual predicates that were laid out over the course of the day. And it was striking because everyone's trying to make sense of this, so people are going to make up their own minds. Congresswoman.
Yeah, normally after, it probably also spoke to the credibility of Michael Cohen. Because if Michael Cohen was not to be believed, given those hours of testimony, you can betcha that Chairman Cummings would have told him, you ought to be thinking about what you said today.
Sure.
His credibility was not impugned, and that's one of the reasons that I think that the chairman thought he should speak about the value of that testimony.
No,
that's what it was about.
You know, we cover Washington. You are a master of Washington. At least you have experience. And a lot of things are planned out very carefully. We were told, of course, and we mentioned to viewers that Mr. Cohen was going to come out and address reporters. And then after what I think was not known, that the chairman was going to end in that way, in that dramatic fashion, the Cohen side with Lanny, they just said they have nothing to add to that. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, thank you for joining us this busy night. Cool. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.